Absence can be cumulative. Absence can make a difference to learning. When young people get to that sort of 90% attendance level, we do start to see negative outcomes in things like academic achievement, peer relationships. There's certainly much more research around now.
You're listening to Around the School Table, hosted by me, Steve Davis, and proudly powered by Xuno Suite. We'll be bringing together the many voices shaping primary and secondary education across Australia, from principals and teachers to education thought leaders and system innovators. Whether you're in the classroom, the staff room, or the boardroom, this is your podcast to be informed, inspired, and connected. Today on Around the School Table, we're joined by Lisa McKay-Brown, Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Melbourne, who brings deep expertise to the complex issue of school refusal. Lisa sheds light on the hidden challenges behind students avoiding school, especially those who are neurodivergent, and offers practical strategies for early identification and compassionate support. We'll also, in this chat, explore how data systems can help schools spot warning signs, the value of consistent routines and strong adult connections, and new international perspectives on multi-tiered support frameworks. For educators who are committed to fostering attendance and engagement with understanding and care, my sense is this conversation is going to be some essential listening. Lisa, welcome to Around the School Table.
Thanks so much for having me here, Steve.
Lisa, we're getting into the topic today of school refusal or school avoidance, which back when I was growing up was ignorantly referred to as wagging. I'm sure you're very well aware of that. But of course, it's more complicated than that term. I believe it's often linked to anxiety, stress, feeling safe. And if we take attendance in Australia, I believe students who are coming to school less than 95% of the time are still considered at risk. So, let's start. What are some of the common misconceptions schools might hold about school-avoiding students, especially those who are neurodivergent?
Wow, that's a complex question to start, but we'll get into it. I think that in the past, certainly schools have had less awareness, perhaps, of the complex factors underlying why young people may not be able to attend school. And I certainly think that, even though this problem existed pre-COVID, I think post-COVID schools are becoming a lot more aware of the difficulties that some young people are having. I think that we sometimes still hear from families and students that perhaps the difficulties they're facing or the complexities of what's happening for them are not always understood, and that, this is not a choice, and that families are struggling to often find the support they need, and young people are struggling to sometimes even articulate what some of the difficulties they're finding are. There's this, I guess, physical response to thinking about being at school that may or may not be linked to, a diagnosed condition. But certainly there's the communication piece, I think, is one of the most important things that we really need to be aware of in this space, about schools taking a curious and non-judgmental approach to trying to find out what's going on and why it might be happening, and seeing what supports they can provide. And families and young people also having an openness to these conversations, because if we don't have that relational approach to this work, it can make it a lot more difficult to create engagement, to create an understanding of what's going on. So, schools are doing everything they can, but we can always, I guess, do more. I think it's important that schools aren't seen as the only, I guess, institutions involved in the response, because it is more complex than that, and we do have to look beyond schools, because schools can only go so far with the resourcing and the staffing that they have, and we need to sort of look beyond that as well.
We might try and come back to that later. Earlier in your answer, you used the term, it's not a choice. Was that in relation to this particular student we might be talking about? It doesn't feel like a choice to be avoiding school.
No, and I mean, I think, probably early on we should say that there are a range of different types of school attendance challenges that young people face. So, this one we're talking about where it not being a choice is school avoidance. The terminology is very fraught. We don't have, a shared terminology that everybody's happy with, but we'll use school avoidance today, acknowledging that there's some tension about that term, in the sense that people seem like it's all about the young person. It's all situated, this problem situated within the young person, but we know it's linked to context and environment and all other things. So we've got school avoidance. We also have truancy, which is that wagging. Earlier when you talked about wagging, that's where a young person is not at school, because often through could be social connections they have out in the community. It could be other things they might be doing in the community that are more attractive than being at school. That's a very simplified response, but what it is, school withdrawal is where a young person might be being home because of family need. And then you've got school exclusion, where young people are being excluded by the school for some particular reason. So if we go back to school avoidance, then often could be sometimes quite a physical response to thinking about being at school, like headaches and stomach aches and feeling sick. And it can really heightened worry and anxiety about having to even step into the school environment itself. So it's not a choice these young people are making. The young people are responding to a range of things that are occurring for them. That means that physically getting into that space is really prohibitive for them.
I'd be curious to hear your response to this. I was working with a psychotherapist in one of my mentoring programs, and we got into some stories, and she said there was a father who had a daughter who was not attending school all the time, and he was quite worried. And she said, well, how often is she not at school? And he said, once or twice a month. And she went, I thought you were going to say once or twice a week. There are so many children who don't find their way until after school. She wasn't overly concerned, and she was also placing a systems lens on this. It's not just the student, there's other things happening.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to hearing that impression? Because I loved school, and I was probably siding with the father, thinking this was the sky was falling down.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it doesn't take much to move into that level of what we would call chronic absenteeism, where a young person needs a lot of resources to help them get back to school. I think if you're seeing a pattern of absence, then it's worth asking why. Now, it might not be a school attendance challenge. It might not be something that's problematic, but we know all absence, absence can be cumulative. Absence can make a difference to learning outcomes. And we certainly know that when young people get to that sort of 90% attendance level, you do start to see negative outcomes in things like academic achievement, peer relationships. There's certainly much more research around now that links to outcomes once you get to that point. So I think that, if families are seeing patterns of absence, then it's worth perhaps asking a question about what might be happening here. As I said, it might not be something that requires intensive treatment and support. It might just be a conversation with the school to try and work out what supports might be needed. If there's a pattern, it might be certain days, certain activities, but it can escalate. So, it's worth prevention and early intervention. That's the mantra here.
Yeah. I want to move to your work at Travancore School, which is connected to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, because, and please correct me if my terms are not correct, because was it Socrates who said the beginning of wisdom is the definition of terms? So I want to try and get them right. Your work at Travancore gave you a unique perspective on school refusal. Can you unpack how that setting, shaped your understanding of school avoidance and all the complex reasons behind it that we've just been touching on?
Yeah. So probably before I started working at Travancore, I did not have the awareness of this problem that I do now. And, I started working there, well, when I was there, it was, I think, 2009, I started working there. So it was a long time ago. But I was involved, I was leading the outreach team there, and our work generally included, as teachers, because I'm a teacher, our work generally included supporting young people who were disengaged from school, more often because of behaviours that they were struggling with, and that schools were struggling with supporting these young people who had some behaviours of concern. So our work was very much shaped on this, but sort of as my time went on and we started looking more at referrals we were getting, because we work in partnership with the Royal Children's Hospital, mental health is one of the partners, and we were getting more referrals to our team for young people who weren't actually going to school at all. But they weren't going to school because they were being excluded for behaviour. They weren't at school because they weren't leaving their bedroom, or they would come into the clinic for appointments, but no matter what the clinician did with regards to therapeutic approaches, they weren't going back to school. So that had us starting to look at, well, what does it take to get young people back to school? What do we need to do? And I think that as a team, what we found was, we were specialist teachers with specialist knowledge in, working with young people with mental health difficulties. We were working in partnership with mental health clinicians, highly skilled clinicians who knew what they were talking about. And we couldn't get kids back to school. So we would get them back, a day, a couple of days, a few hours, but then they would go back to not going. So it led us to sort of really exploring what this thing called school refusal was, what were the best interventions that we could use, and what would that look like. So that's where I guess my interest started. And then when I moved from Travancore to the university, that was when we had the opportunity to actually put research into place, to trial things, to really see if we could do something that would support this particular cohort of young people to get back to school.
Good morning.
Selamat pagi.
Kalimera.
Buongiorno.
Magandang
좋은
umaga.
아침이에요.
Want to make sure every parent feels connected and informed, no matter what language they speak? Communication just got easier. With Xuno's multi-language feature, you can now connect with parents in over 130 languages, automatically translated, instantly understood, whether it's reminders, updates, or celebrations. Families receive your message in their preferred language, with no extra steps from you, no confusion, just clear communication. Every time. Try it today to build stronger school-to-home partnerships, inclusive, effortless, and effective.
In other speaking that you've done, you've mentioned that what works for neurodivergent students in particular often works for all students in this area. So clear routines, strong adult connections, consistency. Have you come across examples of schools successfully implementing these principles to improve attendance or engagement?
I certainly think that there are schools that, once they have an awareness and really think about neuro-affirming principles, are certainly creating settings or environments that are more supportive of neurodivergent youth. So it can be really hard, though, for schools, because, if you're in a secondary school with, 1,500 kids, it's really hard to reshape environments to be, neurodiversity affirming. So I think that, yes, there are absolutely examples of schools who are putting things into practice, who are considering spaces, who are considering ways of teaching and learning, and being very explicit about routines, consistency, understanding the wellbeing processes that need to be in place to provide students with opportunities for breaks or assistance. Absolutely, there are schools doing this work. I guess it's, as with anything, we would like to really be able to spread spread this type of work and really think about how we can better support neurodivergent youth. And I think listening to neurodivergent youth and having them tell us what they need, they often need, they would prefer sometimes smaller class sizes. They would sometimes prefer to have the opportunity to, have some flexibility in how they approach the work that they're doing, to be able to access the self-regulation supports that they need, where some schools might see that as being too flexible. Other schools will step up and go, yeah, absolutely. If you want to wear your headphones in class and listen to music while you're working, that's absolutely fine, if that's what the student needs. But there are also places that maybe be less flexible. So I think it is thinking about, what does inclusive education look like? What does education for all look like? And are the systems that we currently have in place, do that? If they don't work for all, then what do we need to change in the education system itself that allows us to have these viable and flexible pathways for young people, not just when they get to a point where they're disengaging from school.
I realised I did just jump into a focus particularly on neurodivergent students, and that's because I've been prepping for this. I've been immersed in a bit of reading. My take is that such students over-index in relation to this topic. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. So from the research that we know exists, we certainly know that neurodivergent youth have a higher risk of school attendance challenges. It doesn't mean, of course, they will have them, but that risk is there, and also an earlier onset. So that's something that's sort of come out in literature too. The signs may manifest earlier, but it is one of those presentations that can affect any young person, but we certainly know that neurodivergent youth seem to be more impacted.
Can we go a little bit deeper here? Are there some tips perhaps for how a teacher might be able to early diagnose a student and perhaps tackle the problem, particularly while maintaining those relationships with families that are respectful, non-judgmental, but still being proactive?
Yeah, I think so. Being aware of the early warning signs, and that can be tricky because the early warning signs for school attendance challenges, including school avoidance, can look like other things. So, you might see a drop in academic performance, for example, may be linked to that, could be just linked to something else happening in that young person's life. Starting to see irregular attendance, or even wanting to spend more time in, say, a sick bay or wellbeing office. So, finding ways to, be out in other places in the school where they maybe feel safer. Some of the signs schools won't see because they're actually happening at home. And if schools aren't asking questions of families and maintaining that relationship with families, then it can be a while before we know that, when a young person wakes up in the morning, they don't want to get out of bed, or they delay, getting ready for school as long as they possibly can, or they're saying that they don't want to go to school. I don't want to go to school. And, there may be distress even attached to, parents trying to get them out of the house. So there can be things that schools don't actually see. And so if you are seeing data or signs, if you're using your data and looking at it regularly, and you're seeing, changes in attendance patterns, if you're seeing, young people being impacted, peer relationships being impacted, disengagement in the class, spending more time in wellbeing, for example, being late regularly, these may indicate that something else is going on. And then it can be really useful to actually chat to the families and say, what are you seeing at home? Because if families may not communicate this, there is a lot of stigma attached to not being able to get your child to school. So, that relational positioning, that curious questioning, that provision of support, I think, are important from a school perspective.
So, yes, there are things that are going to happen outside of school, and it's not fair that the school's picking up on those necessarily, except where there has been good conversation back and forth. But within the school, I get the sense there could even be some things that might get missed at broad brush if we're not making use of like the school management systems like Xuno, Compass, etc., because they pick up things in the data. So if you were a teacher with that and you were with them, Lisa, where would you be directing their gaze? Where are there little signs that we might not have thought of looking for?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at things like being late to school or leaving early, they're things that might be signs in your data. It could be where you're starting to see missed lessons, because we're certainly seeing, or schools are reporting a little bit more, that young people are getting to school, but they're not always getting to class. So that is something to look for. So maybe they're in period 1 in your secondary school, but when you mark the roll in period 2, they're not there. So looking at that, missing things like, school sport days, things like that could be a sign. So I think it's really interrogating attendance data as one point of data, because you've got all the qualitative and other things you will collect. But your attendance data is a really good starting point for screening young people who you might need to look at a little bit more, particularly that 90 to 95% attendance group, which is where we're sort of saying at risk. What are the patterns there?
I must say, the longer I do around the school table, the more I'm aware of the emerging role of the detective, if you like, the Sherlock Holmes type of detective with this data, to look for things that we might have missed in previous generations. We're actually lucky to have you because you're an expert in this field. You were just invited to the Netherlands. You were presenting on multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS, which I believe is a framework that's even rolling out across my hometown of Adelaide at the moment in some independent schools. Can you give us a bit of an oversight about this initiative?
Yeah, absolutely. We're very excited. Myself and my research partner, Glenn Melbourne from Deakin University, we are about to start a 2-year project with the Association of Independent Schools South Australia. So something that's rolling out in lots of countries at the moment is better go back to the beginning. Multi-tiered systems of support frameworks have been around in schools for a long time. So positive behaviour, behavioural interventions and supports is one, response to intervention is another. So there are frameworks that schools are already using. What we haven't had in the past is a framework, using that framework for attendance and putting in a lens of multi-tiered systems with attendance. And so that's the work that we are doing with ASA. We are going to be working with some of their schools over a 2-year period, implementing this multi-tiered system of support framework for attendance with their schools. So we're going to be running workshops with the schools and helping them create an action plan for the areas they as a school will focus on to try and improve attendance. We'll be providing coaching. Schools will have the opportunity to network with one another, to learn from one another. And we hope to also build resources as part of this project that other schools can benefit from. So it's really exciting that, there was a bequest from a school that unfortunately closed, and that funding has been used to help us work with ASA and their schools to do this particular 2-year project.
As Leonard Cohen says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So that school closure has perhaps shone a light for other students and schools to benefit from.
Yeah.
Your trip to the Netherlands, was there anything else you learned? I mean, did you get a sense of how Australia's going compared to our European counterparts?
Look, this is a challenge everywhere for everyone.
Oh.
There really are not countries that have got what we would like to see with regards to attendance. Certainly chronic absenteeism is problematic in most countries that I am involved with. I think what's really exciting is that there are a lot more national networks developing in countries with a real focus on school attendance and how we can come together. I think we're getting better at having global conversations about that. And certainly I'm part of an organisation called the International Network for School Attendance, which is an international organisation. We often have, 20 countries attending our conferences and things, and to hear about what's happening, the research that's happening, because no one country can do everything. So to be able to learn from one another about what's working and thinking, how might that contextualize for Australia? And that's certainly how we've come to the MTSS work we're doing. Is it started in the US and is now in the Netherlands and Ireland, and there's some work being done in Germany. So, we're all comparing, what we're doing and how we're doing, so that we can say what will work for our context. I think that at this particular conference, we heard more directly from the OECD, which was really interesting, looking at how young people themselves, based on the PISA data, are reporting their attendance or not being at school, and certainly how that is linked to school safety and belonging, or lack thereof, and how it's impacting, their learning. Their learning in schools. That it was really interesting to see that international data that showed very clearly that, once you get to that sort of 90% attendance level, how outcomes in, maths and literacy are impacted. So, I think that, we're getting much more global data, which is allowing us to see country level things, which is really helpful for the work that we do. We can really think, well, where's Australia sitting within this, and what might need to be our focus here.
Interesting to have the OECD lens, because that would be focusing particularly on the economic ramifications of where this then worked its way through nations' economies.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking at policy, and that's something they're doing at the moment, is sort of really doing a comparative study on policy and policy settings around attendance. And we know there'll be a report published next year that will analyse a lot of that. And I think that'll be really great learnings as well.
Yeah. Please promise me, though, at your next meeting of the International Network of School Attendants, can they do a beautiful performative roll call for everyone at the beginning?
Yes. We've got our big conference next year in 2027, so maybe that's the place when we're all together again.
Yes, present. Yes.
Yep.
Just closing, back in 2023, there was the Senate inquiry into school refusal and other recommendations. It made 14 recommendations. The federal government noted about 12 and agreed in principle to 2. So, if we have a federal minister listening to this podcast right now, what would you like to say to them?
I would like to say that we need national leadership on this. I think I understand why the responses were sent back to state and territory governments, because that is who runs education. It is run locally by our states and territories. However, this is a national problem, and I think we need national leadership in this space. And one of the recommendations was a national action plan that brings together the voices of people who are impacted by this. And for me, the points within that national action plan, I think, would be really worth exploring. I think if we could have a national action plan that then states and territories could use to help guide their responses, I feel that would be something helpful, because there are voices we're not hearing. There is a lot of work being done that we don't know about, and we certainly found that when we had our own national conference early in February. The number of people who came together that are doing work in this space that we don't know about, that nobody knows about. This is an opportunity for us to bring this critical mass of people who are passionate and want to make a difference in this space to come together with the education jurisdictions to say, what can we do? Because it's not going away. The data is telling us it's actually getting worse. So what can we do together to really move us into a place where we've got solutions that work.
Lisa McKay-Brown, thank you very much for joining me around the school table.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.